Hello, Norway. Nice to see you. Hope you're all well and safe. This is exciting. It's a bit of an adventure for us. I've never done a video keynote before, so we don't really know what we're doing. My son Quinn is helping me out, so strap in, get excited for the adventure. What we're planning to do is to take you to 3 different spots where we're doing quite a bit of sort of early childhood, outdoor, environmental learning at least one of the sort of interesting schools that I spend a lot of time working with. But before I do that, I'll tell you a little bit about who I am, what I'm going to do, what might happen. My hope is to kind of nail 3 different stories, one for each of these spots, that comes out of research we've been doing here on the west coast of BC. As you'll notice, this is a beautiful estuary here behind me. Folks are starting to look at the salmon maybe. You can see a little bit of smoke in the air. That's because the fires that are burning south in the United States are blowing their smoke all the way up here. So here we are in these radical, crazy, interesting, unusual times. COVID is happening and we've got sort of climate change induced fires happening. So it seems to me this kind of work is really important right now. We need to think hard about it. So that's what I'm going to do. For the next 20 minutes, we'll spend a little bit of time thinking hard about this thing. I'm going to try and tell 3 stories. I'm going to take you to 3 different spots where learning's been happening outside. Who am I? That might be helpful. I'm Sean Blenkinsop. I'm a professor at a place called Fraser University. And about 10 years ago, a group of researchers and myself actually started an environmentally based outdoor public school. So it's a K through 7 public school where the students spend all their time outdoors. They actually don't have a school building whatsoever. Now that came about because we were trying to think about how to change schooling, how to move schooling, how to, in some ways, undercut sort of modern Western philosophical orientations towards schooling that tend to be at least unenvironmental in their theories, if not anti-environmental in their theories. So it was a chance for us to kind of really play with some important, tricky, challenging issues. All right, I should tell you about the first story. So the first story, I'm going to grab my computer here because I need it for a piece of it. So the first story has to do with relationship. One of the key things that we've seen in the work we've done is that building relationship with the natural world, both teachers and students and families and caregivers and community members, is really, really important. That means spending time. That means spending a lot of time in the natural world. If you have no building, you end up spending a lot of time in the natural world. But it also means thinking hard about how that time is spent and what's going on with that time. So I wanted to read you a little bit of research stuff that came from one of the students. This student is, at the point in time that this interview takes place, is about 8 years old. Right? And part of this research and part of this work with the student actually led us into thinking about what we now call nature as co-teacher and nature as teacher. So here it is. So Raven, she chose that name, is 8 years old at the time, and she's talking to one of our researchers, a doctoral student of mine. Raven. So the researcher starts by saying, "So, do you hear the plant?" And Raven says, "Yeah, but you have to hear it through your heart." The researcher asks, "I was going to ask where you hear it. Do you hear it in your heart?" Raven, "Little words curl into your mind. You have to know that you're not thinking." Another day, the researcher asks her again what the process of listening to the natural world is like for her. Raven, "This sounds funny. You're focused on something, but you're not actually thinking about it. If you're thinking, then you're not really listening. See, I can't do it now when I'm talking to you." Researcher, "Do you feel like you have conversations with the natural world?" Raven, "It's not exactly like that. It's not speaking. It's more like energy or signals. You don't hear it out loud. It's something that your mind and only your mind can understand because nature is that open to any language. So if you were just thinking, not even in your language, just showing pictures, it would still work." Researcher, "The conversation you mean?" Raven, "Yes, it doesn't have to be speaking." Researcher, "So you mentioned energies and signals. What do you mean by that?" Raven, "Well, see, you speak your way, they speak different ways, like thousands of different ways, billions. It's like the birds with those signals. Like when you see a bird flapping in the sky and a flock of birds, how they all move at the same time. It's because they tell each other, like through mental speaking. All right, so a couple of things I want to pull from that. One is the sort of depth of relationship that we're starting to hear Raven have. Now she's growing up, she started in kindergarten, she stayed in the school all the way through to grade 7. And you can hear this depth of relationship that's going on. She thinks about the natural world as speaking to her, as being active, as being agential, as have something to say to her, as being important in the way in which she sort of thinks about the world. I also want to note how magnificently she shapes those metaphors, right? Think about like the words curl into your mind and this sort of, and they talk in messages. So holding that kind of conversation, what I want to pull forward and what that school has pulled forward has been this conversation around nature as co-teacher, right? So starting to think about the natural world not as a backdrop for education, not as a utilitarian thing to experiment on, but thinking about the natural world as being agential, as being active, as being engaging, as having something to teach, as knowing things. Right? So that starts to have some really serious implications when you start to think about this kind of education. If you're going to do this outdoor environmental education, if you're going to start to what recently I've been calling ecologizing education, right? One of those things is you're going to have to de-center the teacher, the human teacher. Right? If you co-teach with somebody else, automatically you want to give space for their expertise, for their abilities, for their experiences, all that kind of stuff to come through. Right? So you have to do the same thing in terms of the natural world, which also then has implications for how you think human in terms of knowing. You have to start to move away from humans being experts, humans having all of the knowledge, human teacher being the source of knowledge and the only source of knowledge, and being able to kind of connect into the expertise of all of those knowledges around you. Right? So what that starts to look like pedagogically is it starts to look like a sort of decentering of the human teacher and a move towards a kind of humility that sees knowledge as being shared, as being fluid, as being gatherable, as being incomplete. And all of those things make for a really interesting change in the way in which pedagogy starts to play out and the way in which human teachers have to sort of think about being present. 2 more things I want to note here in this spot. How am I doing for time, Quinn? Do you have any idea?
8 minutes.
8 minutes already? Okay, 2 more things I want to note. The first one has to do with time. And it just means, as I said before, kind of spending more time in natural places, building those relationships. As they always say, if you want to sort of teach folks to care and love a place, then you need to allow them the space to build those relationships. They have to do that work, right? 2, in terms of time, is to actually start to play around with linear time a little bit, to actually start to think about other kinds of time, whether it be cyclical. Very soon the salmon are going to start to come up in this river. We get 3 species of the 5 species in BC come up this river. So, and as the rains come in, the salmon will start to move up the river. But that then has implications for how you decide the cycles of your teaching. You can't just do salmon whenever you want to. You have to be somehow connected into the world. The second piece that I want to play with is this idea of practice. So you can hear how if nature becomes a co-teacher, how your practice as an educator, your pedagogical practice starts to change. You have to provide that space. You have to de-center yourself, those kinds of things. But I also want to start to think about relationship itself as a practice. That building relationship to the natural world takes this time, takes this energy. It's a kind of discipline, the way in which a meditative practice might be a discipline. It takes time, and you build this practice of having a relationship with the natural world. That then sets you up as an educator to be better able to respond to the spontaneous, be better able to sort of respond to students' questions as they're starting to play with it, and to be more comfortable in these outdoor spaces. All right, we're back. This is site number 2. Here, I'm going to steal this from Quinn for a second. Just make sure I don't put my fingers in the wrong spot. I'm going to take you out here. Come along for the ride. This is what we're doing. So this is another one of the spots. This is a second school that I work with. Now this school, again, an eco-environmental school, they see them spend sort of half their days outside and half their days in the school. They struggled with trying to figure out how to best scaffold things like numeracy and literacy for their students. So what they did was they created this kind of school where they could be half indoors and half outdoors. And this is a second spot that they spend a lot of time at. You'll see the ocean out there, and you can actually see the smoke from the fires that's blowing through. And actually, if you look here, you'll see this is the sort of bulkhead. You got lots of people who are walking down there. But the kids will often build forts and they'll build stores. Yeah, they have this whole store system where all the stores sell rocks. And the great thing about all the selling of rocks is that it just takes a rock to buy a rock. So you can show up at the store and pick up a rock off the ground, hand it to the store owner, and they will give you a rock of your choice. It's a fantastic, deeply equitable system, and lovely to watch. But the story that I'm going to tell this time actually comes from this beach. A couple of 5-year-olds, early childhood school, the kindergarten classes down here, they all have their little backpacks with their safety stuff and their rain gear and their food and things like that. And they come and they meet and they gather and they're playing. And they're playing around. Here, I'll hand the camera back to Quinn. And so what's happening is you have all the kids kind of playing. They're spread out in different kinds of places. And one child, let's name them Quinn, because Quinn is running the camera. One child who has a long history of being super excited by insects, sits down and starts to watch a nest of ants. It's actually just over here, and they right along the shore there. And he's excited by the nest of ants. He's thinking about the nest of ants. He also, at one point in time, starts to offer a little bit of food, but he's really conscious to just offer a little bit of food so the ants don't sort of over-reproduce in response to getting too much food. That's the kind of thing that Quinn thinks about. Completely engaged in that. Other kids are doing other things. Now, somewhere down the beach is another boy, right? This boy, I'm going to name this boy Olga, after my friend Olga Jensen, after my Norwegian friend. Sorry, Quinn, I'm backing you up. So, Olga is that kind of rambunctious, boily, really active 5-year-old. He'll jump into play here, get bored, jump into play somewhere else, get bored, jump into play somewhere else, get bored. And he kind of explores and runs around a lot, that kind of stuff, and tries to kind of jump into play wherever he can. Lately, he's been having a little bit of trouble kind of making friends because he's trying to figure out what it means to be a boy, how he sort of makes sense of being pushy and things like that. So he actually comes over and kind of enters into Quinn's action with the ants. So you remember Quinn's here watching the ants. Now, the way in which Olga decides to enter into the action is to actually start stepping on ants. So he comes in and he'll step on an ant and kind of notice what's going on. Of course, this really irritates Quinn. Quinn starts to respond. Quinn wants to push back. Olga steps on another ant. Olga Jensen wouldn't do this. Olga steps on another ant, and we start to get this kind of escalation going on, such that Quinn even tries to kind of push Olga away and protect the ants and kind of gather the ants. The ants, of course, simultaneously are all rushing to the site of death because that's the way in which ants work. They kind of come to support their fallen, as it were. So what I want you to do now is just take 30 seconds, and I'll stop talking. Quinn will pan around and look at the ocean a little bit, and I want you to think about what you would do in this situation as a teacher. How do you step into this situation? All right, that's great. So probably lots of ideas going on, ideas of how to separate, thinking about who's the bully, how to kind of get them to talk to each other, how to get them to work it out. I'm wondering how many of you added the ants into the conversation? How many of you sort of thought about whether there's sort of restitution that needed to be paid to the ants, how you sort of think about the ants in terms of that scenario? For the teachers at this school, they've been playing with sort of the notion of the natural world is being colonized. And as a result, they start to think about what it means as human colonizers to include this kind of active, agential natural world into the mix. So that's what's going on at that point in time. So I want you to kind of play with that. I'm going to add one more piece to the whole scenario. So you remember, we've got Quinn looking at the ants, we've got Olga coming to join in. But before Olga comes and joins in, Quinn actually calls to one of the adult female researchers, a researcher who absolutely loves the natural world, spends a ton of time in the natural world, and who the kids love showing things to around the natural world. You all have met people like this. Anyway, Quinn invites the researcher over, and the researcher stands, and the two of them are engaged in playing with the ants, thinking about the ants, talking about the ants. Olga now enters the scene, right? And this actually has happened a few times, so we need to name it and think about it. Olga enters the scene and starts stepping on ants. In the process of stepping on ants, though, Olga is not worried about what Quinn is doing. Olga will actually look up, look at the female researcher, step on an ant, and watch the female researcher's reaction. Olga does it a second time, looks at the female researcher, steps on the ant. Right? What I want to posit here is that if we're starting to think about nature as colonized, then part of what we have to do as educators in this kind of work is add this level of criticality. Because I think what you're witnessing here is you're witnessing a coupling of patriarchal conversations and nature as colonized conversations, right? That in fact what's going on is Olga is trying to figure out his power over, as a boy, as a male, as a young male, right? Over the female and what's going on and how you could potentially affect and influence the other, particularly others who have a deep relationship to the natural world. Now I want to translate that out into the kind of larger sort of cultural setting where in fact you can see the kind of violence that happens to the natural world and the way in which often there's coupling of violence to women, to marginalized populations, to children, and to the natural world. And that whole conversation together suggests to me that we have to spend a lot of time thinking about teacher as kind of critical activists in response to nature as colonized. One last little note, there's been some really interesting research that's just come out, done by the UN, that suggests that countries that have the worst environmental policies, the most problematic environmental policies, also tend to have the most problematic gendered policies. They tend to be more patriarchal. So this coupling that we're noticing in this tiny little interaction is actually playing out at a kind of global scale as well. For teacher practice, what does it mean? It means being really aware, being thoughtfully critical, being able to name and notice those things when you name them, right? Bringing the natural world as an active being that has rights in its own, right? You have to rethink a lot of that kind of stuff altogether. All right, that's probably more than my 7 minutes at this spot, but hopefully that's given us some stuff to think about. Welcome to the rainforest. I'm gonna do this again. All right, so here we are, Western Canadian, temperate rainforest. That's a great big mama cedar there, mama red cedar playing around. What I want you to look at though is a little bit, have a look at the ground in this area, right? You'll see it's the kind of classic area where the students come. This is their sort of third classroom. Oh, there goes a dog coming through the scene. It's a kind of classic way in which...
Hi.
Hello, nice to see you.
How are you guys?
Doing all right.
Good.
Yeah. You're going to go live in Norway on this one.
All right.
Yeah. All right, so we had visitors walk through. Classic in the outdoor classroom is to have visitors come through. What I was saying was I just want you to have a quick look at what's going on. You can see the effect that's being had. Just a few little feet running around, spending lots of time here. If you look in the background, you'll see that really beautiful stump at the back. So, back to Quinn with the camera. Here's the story that I want to tell. The first environmental school that we started about 10 years ago. We've actually had kids graduate from that school into high school at this point in time. It's been really interesting watching that kind of progress. If I had enough time, we could talk about that. But what I really want to talk about is I want to talk about the village building. And it connects to what happens here in this kind of space, the sort of effect that we have on the space. So one of the classic pieces in kind of outdoor environmental experiential education has always been sort of gathering from the work of a guy named David Sobel, who's a place-based educator in the United States. He talks about a kind of universality of the way in which children really, really love to build spaces. They love to build forts. They love to build, and they love to play in them. And that, in fact, some of that playing is really important. It becomes part of figuring out what it means to be adult. It becomes part of the maturation process. But it also is really important in that kind of building of relationship with the place, because you get to know the materials, you get to know what they can do, you get to touch things, you get to hold things, you get to move things apart. You also have an influence which needs to be played with in terms of children. So what happens is that school decided they were going to spend upwards of an hour a day letting the children play in the village. So the children would go, they would build their forts, develop like incredible fine motor skills. You got 4-year-olds who are doing really sophisticated lashings and things like that, right? And the village kind of grew, and it was successful. Kids were playing and that kind of stuff. And then what started to happen after about 4 months is that the village itself started to gain its own kind of larger rules and systems and ways of being, including, right, one of the older boys was elected, I think that's loosely construed, was elected to be the leader of the village. That boy sort of developed a kind of posse, a team of support, of police officers, right? And the village turned into having a prison, it had a casino, and you had this kind of autocratic, dictatorial, power down kind of governance structure starting to take place. Now, this in some ways surprised us, which probably it shouldn't have, but it did. It surprised us because we were under the assumption that if students were immersed in the natural world for a long period of time, they would build relationships, they would be more relational in their interactions and things like that, until we saw this happening in the forts. And we realized that what was going on was we were actually pushing back against some of the literature that suggests just kind of spend time and good things will happen. But we are also running up against the kind of imaginative limits of the children's play. And in fact, I think, our own imaginative limits as adults and as teachers in those kinds of situations. That the kids were using the tools of the culture within which they were immersed as part of their play. So if they're starting to figure out how to be an adult, they have to use the tools that they see of adulthood around them in order to kind of structure this play. So in some ways, they were recapitulating some of the problematic ways of orienting towards the world that the school itself was actually built to worry about and to try to push back against. Which meant that we as a teaching team and as a research team had to gather and kind of try to think about the kinds of tools we might offer into these settings in order to help the students kind of figure out different ways of being. Interestingly enough, there were lots of dissenting voices. So there were lots of other ideas for how governance could happen within that space. But it became dominated by this particular sort of central voice and the autocracy that the punitive autocracy that developed. So we as a teaching team and a research team sort of started to build and started to do interventions. But what it made us start to think about was that, so we end up in this co-teaching kind of conversation, humans and the natural world working together to do this teaching. But that doesn't mean that the human has to kind of abdicate their role in all of this conversation. So you see, in this situation, humans were actually doing part of the mediating and part of the pushing. And in some ways, the way in which we started to contextualize it was both that the teacher themselves was in some ways being an activist in these kinds of conversations, and as in that they were actively sort of making decisions about the kind of world that the students had access to, the kind of world that they were imagining, the kinds of worlds that they were involved in creating. So that's the piece number one. The second piece around this was that the teachers started to see quite clearly how this project was a project of cultural change. That in fact, there are some really, really deep tropes that kind of push us back into, or, I don't know, reassert sort of status quo's ways of being. And that if you're going to teach in this kind of work and do this kind of work and try to bring the natural world in and make things more equitable at a larger scale, you're going to have to think about some of your work as being this sort of project of cultural change. Two more things that I really want to note at this point in time. Just that going back to some of the earlier discussions, you'll notice that the teachers are dealing with different things than they might deal with in a classroom. Part of that is because the classroom has its own structures and its own ways of being that are sort of built into the structure of the classroom and the notion of school and sort of the way bells go off and things like that. But also that there are things that sort of spontaneously arise, things that appear, right? Somebody walks through the middle of a filming with their dogs and you have that conversation. Or, come on over here for a second, right? Or you notice this is a culturally modified cedar tree. So the local indigenous community, who are called the Seychelles people, right, come here and gather cedar. Cedar is a really important piece of their culture. They build hats out of it as part of their ceremonies, right? They've actually used to build giant ocean-going canoes out of single trees and things like that. So all of a sudden you get these spontaneous moments where teaching can happen and teaching can occur. And of course a child is going to go, hey, what about that? Or what about those dogs? Or what about those kinds of things? And all that stuff then becomes part. So the human teacher needs to be able not only to facilitate and mediate, but also to respond in rich ways to what seems to be kind of percolating up as a result of their sort of co-teaching conversation, right? So that's number one. I can't remember number two is that they may have to deal with things that are often outside of the purview of a public school teacher. Things like death of ants, right? That kind of thing becomes a part of the discussion. You not be involved in conversations about life and death and flourishing. If you remember thinking about this space that the kids have been playing in a lot, right? Those are conversations that are going to have to be part of being alive and being outdoors in this kind of space. All right. There's so much more I wish I could have gotten to, but I think I've probably filled up at least 20 minutes of your time in this kind of stuff. I hope you liked seeing those 3 spots. So those are the 3 classrooms that this school tends to go to. They go to the forest, they go to the estuary, and they go to the beach, which allows them to have this kind of diversity of teachers in terms of things. It's all within about a 15-minute walk, even for the little ones, a 15-minute walk. And they'll build full days into some of these kinds of programs. I hope you appreciate Quinn's work, spectacular cameraman that he is. And hopefully what I've done is I've planted some seeds of potential conversation. That's really what I hope to do. Right? I'm pushing some seeds and pushing some ideas. Some of them may be potentially challenging, but I'm hoping that you'll be willing to kind of pick them up, play with them, and make them work as best fits your situation in Norway and the kind of teaching that you're doing and the possibilities that you see in them. I'm happy to talk further whenever you want. I might even be around to answer questions, although I think it's like midnight my time at this point in time. Thanks very much. Thanks, Quinn. Enjoy.